Hey guys, welcome to another Jamaican Tales video, a Jamaican living in Germany. In a previous video, I talked about just how frustrating it was being back home in Jamaica and having to deal with speaking in English and Patois again because my mind was just like not there anymore. Since I made that video and since I've been to Jamaica, this question in my head has been, can you actually forget your native language or I think it's native language or mother tongue? Yeah, whatever it is. But can you forget it? My language experience, of course, started with Jamaican Patois. Now, this is a dialect that we have in Jamaica, and I would say this is the first language that I learned because that's the language that my family spoke. And then when I went to school, of course, I started learning English. In high school, started learning Spanish. And then later on, of course, a bit of German. Being the person I am, always traveling to different places and living in a foreign country, you start adapting and you start adjusting a few things. And language, of course, is one of those things. Now, I didn't recognize what I was doing back then. At that point, I thought, okay, Oshando, you're always traveling, you're talking to people, and English is not their first language. So you should learn to speak, or you should try to speak English in a simplified way, a way that they can actually understand so that you don't have to spend half of the time explaining, okay, this is what this word or this expression means. It got to the point where I would not only just speak simply, but I would even use the same mistakes or speak the way that they would speak. Even though it was wrong, I was like, okay, I'm gonna speak this way because this is how you speak, and I guess this is how it makes sense in your brain, so I'm gonna start speaking this way. It was not the best idea. Living in Germany, I'm surrounded by German. Everything is in German. I walk on the streets, I hear people speaking in German. I read things in German at work. Sometimes I speak to people in German. It's a language that I think in. It's a language that I speak in. I even dream in German. A couple of years ago, I went to New York after a long time and I got there and I guess I was so exhausted from the trip there and stuff, and I was speaking in my sleep. And I wasn't even speaking in English, I was speaking in German. And I was like, I couldn't understand it. Even to this day, I don't understand that. I was exhausted, but my brain thought, oh, okay, the language that we're gonna speak in is German. As if that would take less effort than English. I speak to myself sometimes in German when I'm planning out things and talking to myself. There are times when I think that English is somehow not adequate and it's not sufficient to express certain things and to express certain feelings. I use German for that, which is kind of weird that, how things have switched around. It's like, my brain is weird. 2 years ago, when I was doing this trip across Central and South America, and of course, trying to, bring back all the Spanish that I learned back in high school, there were many times I would be trying to speak in Spanish, and then there's just a German word that just popped up, and I'm like, no, that's not the language that I want. It was confusing for me because I'm like, why is my brain giving me German and not English? My brain has kind of switched the priorities of the language to say that, okay, German, that's number one. English, yeah. And then Spanish is there. And I won't even talk about Patois because that's an embarrassment right there. It's an embarrassment. It's a big embarrassment as a Jamaican. All of this German influence has completely messed up languages in my brain, really. Even in English, sometimes I write or I speak English with a German grammar, or I approach English from a German perspective. Sometimes I think I sound very German in the way that I speak English. This is the impact that this language has had on my life. Taken over my life completely, you could say. Is it possible for you to completely forget your native language, or even not completely, but even forget parts of it? Now, I have a good friend, Arthur, and he's German, but we usually speak in English. One of the questions that I hate when he asks me is like, how do you say this German thing in English? I hate that question because it's embarrassing for me, first of all, and so frustrating. For example, he's speaking to me in English. Why am I saying English? English. He speaks to me in English, and then there's a word that he can't remember what it is in English, and then he asks me, okay, how do you say this word in English? It's embarrassing because most times I can't remember what the English word for it is. German, I know 100% what he's talking about. To tell him what the English word is, I'm like, I don't know. 5 minutes later, sometimes I figure it out. Sometimes it's like I have to go and search in the translator. This is your first language and you can't even remember what something is called. One of the recent examples was hammock. I don't know when was the last time I used the word hammock. And yeah, you're not using the word, so of course, retrieving that information becomes harder and harder. That's my experience, and I was curious to find out what science has to say about it. So I did a little research and I found some articles on the BBC website and also this blog called The Language Doctors. There's some researchers that say, okay, you can forget your language. Some that say, no, it's not possible. Yes, you can forget your native language because you might not use your native language anymore for thinking, for talking, for dreaming. They also mention that you, for example, you grow to like the new language, for example, the sound of the language, and you adjust the way that you think based on that language. Depending on the language that you speak, it also adjusts the way that you think and the way that you approach different things in your life. Your age also impacts whether or not you can forget your native language. Because like, for example, kids, when they move from the country that they were born in, they were there, let's say 6 years old, and they go somewhere else with a completely different language and nobody speaks to them in the language that they learned, it's possible for them to completely forget that language. But of course, the older you are, the more challenging it is. The problem though is that sometimes you forget words, you forget expressions, you forget some of the nuances about the language and so on. But I guess it's more challenging for you to completely forget the language the older you get. On the other side, there are the people that say it's not possible for you to forget your native language because they look at it from the perspective, like, for example, you learned how to walk when you were a child. You don't forget irrespective of where you go. So it's somehow very challenging or even sometimes impossible for you to just completely forget. They also say that our brains can, of course, manage it. Polyglots there speaking 10, 15 languages. So, of course, it's possible for us to learn additional languages. So just because you're learning additional languages doesn't actually necessarily mean that you forget the language that you learned. The fact is, it even improves how your brain works when you actually learn multiple languages. At least that's what research say. I kind of feel stupid most times, so I'm not too sure if that applies to me. On this side of the argument, they also say, yeah, you don't forget the language. It just moves to the other side of your brain. And what that means is that the retrieval of that information becomes more challenging. You can think of the brain as a path. It's like if you use a path over and over again, you know, it's easier for you to find the path. But then if you don't use that path for a while and the bushes grow up and stuff, it's going to take a while for you to get back. I've not completely forgotten English, of course, because I can still speak a little English. I might sound like someone that's just learning how to speak English, according to some of my friends. It becomes more challenging when you're like completely, you know, in the culture and in a different place to like, you know, get back to this, you know, this fluency where you just speak it without thinking. It takes more effort for me to recall certain information because it's like sometimes I'm literally translating from German to English because that's just the thing that's like the quickest to get to. Pretty sure many of you out there, you might be having a similar experience where you're like, okay, I'm forgetting my native language. And I discovered that there are some tips that you can use to actually prevent that or slow that down a bit. Very logical tips. One of the tips on the Language Doctor's website was, yeah, speak with native people. I'm like, okay, cool. What I would suggest is go home more often. They also, of course, recommend reading in the native language, which is definitely a good thing because then some of the words that might not be at the front of your mind, and reading, of course, opens up your mind. And by extending that with also media, so for example, listening to music or podcasts or watching videos in your native language is also very, very useful. So there you go. That's all I have to say on the topic of forgetting your native language. If you guys are going through the same problem, let me know down in the comments. How are you guys managing with forgetting your native language, or how do you actually prevent that from happening? Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and see you in the next Jamaican Tales video.